Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
Welcome to the 40th episode of Quarantine, a show that started on March 17th, at the very dawn of this pandemic moment, a show that kind of even then we realized was about building a world that was accelerating. This notion that the future, which was maybe 15 or 20 years out, had arrived all at once, and we would be confronting the future of work, racial relations, how we work through climate change, political issues, just a lot faster. And today's show really picks up on this theme of where we're headed. Today's show is called Opportunity at Work, and we're talking to two people that are looking at how one marshals the workforce to get things done both faster, and also how do we use a workforce with the very notion of how we educate them isn't keeping up with the kind of skills that people have. This becomes important for how we build an economy and how we move forward. Mickey, welcome to our 40th happy birthday show.
Hey, Peter. Yeah, I heard it was your mom's birthday. How old is she?
My mother is 93 today.
Wow.
Right. She was born during Prohibition.
Oh, wow.
I guess, right? Of course, she was too young for that to make a difference, but yes. She's
happy birthday,
93.
Peter's mom.
We're 40 days old. And on the very day we started this, Mick, we said, I was just looking up a note that you and I wrote to each other. We said, this COVID crisis is leading to one of the fastest moments of cultural, economic, and media change in American history all at once. We're isolated and learning how to use media anew. Cultural organizations, museum, conference, performance have long dabbled in the virtual, but that will now move forward. The economy will be devastated, and yet it'll force a more urgent, action-oriented conversation about flourishing local economies and governments, how to get beyond extractive global capitalism, and how to value people's contribution to society more than ever before, which I believe is the topic we have come to today on human capital and how people contribute to society.
It is. I'm really excited to have the guests today. You know, I think we hear all the time about all the bad news, and there's plenty of tough stuff happening right now. But I actually think what Scott and Karan are going to talk about are some of the glimmers of light, and it has to do with, you know, if we've got now tens of millions of people moving to unemployment or having challenges about what's going to happen, how am I going to pay my rent in the next few months? What they're looking at and focusing on is how do we actually get people to work? And how do we both surge higher when we've got to handle something like this emergency and have an emergency response, but also how do we help people that, you know, maybe they don't have a bachelor degree, but they actually have all sorts of skills that they've learned from doing stuff. It's non-trivial to do a lot of the things they work on, and how do we help them go from, you know, a lower paying job to a higher paying job by actually just learning on the job, and how do we actually help people relax those constraints, you know, where you have to have a bachelor degree and the algorithm filters you right out, right? You're not even going to get considered, even if you might have some of the best power and skills and mindsets ever. So that's what the topic is. Let's bring our two guests on, Scott and Karan. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us, and happy birthday to your mom, Peter, and happy 40th show.
And if she's not watching this, I'm going to make sure tomorrow she watches this happy birthday component. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, we can sing for her too.
Yeah.
Happy birthday.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone wants to hear me sing. Scott, can you just introduce yourself a bit, and then Karan, just a little bit of who you are?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Scott. I work with LinkedIn Talent Solutions. So This is a part of LinkedIn that is really focused on helping people hire. So members like you and I, the LinkedIn is a place to get a job, and for millions of people and for thousands of companies, LinkedIn is a place to hire. And so that's what I think about all day.
Excellent. Karan.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. So Karen Chopra, I'm a co-founder of an organization called Opportunity at Work, which focuses on how you get individuals who do not have a 4-year college degree, whom we call STARS, skilled through alternate routes, placed into middle and higher wage work. And my background is mainly entrepreneurial on ventures that are focused on economic mobility, both here in the US through Opportunity at Work, but also in West Africa, which is where I grew up.
Hey, I'd love to plant a question, which we don't necessarily have to address up front, but both of you are doing very innovative things that are finding the skills in people and can route around things like either traditional 4-year educations or finds people skills, and therefore they don't have to have all this traditional stuff. And all of your innovation is happening at the same time when our 4-year colleges are coming under enormous pressure. And some may be near collapse because of the economic model and people are at home and the endowments aren't that big. Do you ever think about that irony that you're accelerating finding skills and that actually is an additional complicating factor to the business model or the value that people see in colleges?
That's a great question and a big one, and happy to pick that one up when we get to that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, same.
It's tricky. You know, recently I saw that Moody's ranked a number of some of the major colleges in the United States as junk bonds. I mean, they're literally like they don't get very high rankings for, and this was actually pre-COVID. And obviously now we're seeing really bad experiments, natural experiments going on in college campuses across the country and probably around the world with people trying probably bad approaches to opening up at all physically. But we'll see how it goes. It's hard when you're 16 or 17 or 18 years old and finally want to get out of the house and actually move somewhere and start your adult life. Why don't we zoom in on Scott to start with? Scott, Karan, we'll come back to you in a little bit. Scott, tell me a little bit about the journey of, you wake up, you're at LinkedIn, and whoa, shelter in place is happening. And it turns out an awful lot of people are having real challenges from a medical standpoint in terms of just the hospitals and the healthcare and all that. Tell me what happened at that moment for you.
So we were doing our thing that we do at LinkedIn, which is helping companies hire on LinkedIn and helping people find jobs when COVID hit. And we started getting some very different kinds of requests than we had ever heard of before. And specifically, they were for a level of surge hiring, particularly in a few industries. Healthcare, comes to mind. Supply chain and delivery comes to mind. Supermarkets, and the requests for support for surge hiring to react to what had happened were immense. So, for example, the National Health Service contacted us and said they were looking for something on the order of 30,000 doctors and 60,000 nurses. We started getting the Red Cross of Los Angeles contacted us and said, we're looking for 300 volunteers a day to maintain food security, for example, for families and for children. And we have solutions at LinkedIn to help hire, but not at these types of volume. And so what we saw, or what we realized was happening, was that while we were flattening the curve, in order to help, and there's a visual for this, I don't know if we can show it just to kind of like help illustrate what this was. While we were flattening the curve, organizations were also trying to raise the line. So just increase the response capacity of hospitals, increase the response capacity for not-for-profits. And, we felt like, wow, we have a big responsibility here and a big opportunity to help organizations do this at a massive scale with LinkedIn. Unfortunately, though, we were not built to do it. So immediately we put together a war room where we brought together product managers, anyone really who wanted to get involved. And we put together an ambitious plan that said every single day counts for how we are going to create a solution for this. And we want to launch something within 10 days. And, for context in big company innovation, launching something as a solution in 10 days is completely unheard of. I love this idea that design loves constraint, and innovation is very much driven by constraint. And this was a sort of beautiful constraint. We said, like, we have 10 days. What can we do to help this?
Scott, what was the principal thing you had to change that your systems couldn't handle? Because it's software, and if you need to reach more people, one could do it, but there must be a fundamental state change that happened that forced you to rethink things.
Yeah, I mean, so what we did is we said people need to hire, particularly hospitals. So we said, let's start with the healthcare industry. That seems like the greatest impact for. And remember, at this time, Italy is having capacity surges. Things are just about starting in New York. We're not sure if this is going to happen all across the country. Hospitals are clamoring to prepare for this, including in California with Governor Newsom asking for, thousands of nurse volunteers to set up this kind of capacity. So we said, look, we need to take out the friction and make hiring as quick as possible. So what is the easiest stuff that we can do? First thing, we have a successful jobs product where you can post a job and people can apply. Let's just make that free. If that's an easy friction release, if people don't have budget or contracts, let's just forget all of that. Right now we're just trying to figure out the greatest social impact. So we just started offering our jobs for free across the healthcare industry, delivery industry, etc. The second thing we said is, like, let's take these most important jobs that we have and tag them so they get a supercharger promotion across our platform. So if you have a frontline COVID-19 job, you can get this tag, and it will make sure that the right people see this. At the same time, we for volunteers, we needed to find 300 volunteers, for example, for the Red Cross. So we said, what can we do about this? And we looked at actually a media product, which is normally not purpose-built for volunteer hiring, but what you can do is put up an ad on LinkedIn, and there's a button, and we can change that call to action button to say, hey, I'd like to volunteer. And we talked to our members. It's pretty cool being in a big company. You can sometimes run research really quickly. We talked to over 1,000 members on LinkedIn. We said, do you guys want to volunteer? And 64% of people saying, I want to volunteer. 22% were actively looking, but just couldn't figure out how they could effectively do that. And so we started, repurposing our media assets, for example, to get, in the end, we've been able to source over 500,000 volunteers for COVID-related charities through that mechanism. So,
wow.
Innovation.
Stop there for a second, Scott. Just because I think, that this notion of you've got these different business units and they're all, kind of doing their thing. And your team here is like, we have 10 days, every day counts. Like, what can we do? And you're like picking up the phone, you're like, twisting arms, or is it really everybody's super excited? Like, oh, wait, yeah, we could do that. I mean, tell me about kind of just getting it done. What you can talk about.
I think, I have to say very genuinely that LinkedIn as a culture and as a company is very purposeful. We really do talk about, creating economic opportunity for everyone in the world. So really, I think the ethos of the company is very socially inclined. And so it wasn't a hard arm twist for people to say, what are we going to do here? If we want to, if we think about it super tactically, what was also happening from a business perspective, though, is COVID was halting all of our forward roadmaps because people in organizations needed to pivot. And so all the plans that we had were basically paused for a breath while we were figuring out how to proceed. And in that pause, we were an initiative that was very clear about our motive and very clear about the impact that we could have. And so the combination of people wanting to get involved, having a little bit more capacity to do so, meant that everyone could come together very quickly, which was great. We actually did a post-mortem on this because we've never launched like this in 10 days. And we tried to distill
10 days go to market kind of plan. And usually it takes how long to get a sort of a new thing out to trial at scale or trial at anything?
For this size of thing, I would say 6 months to 2 years.
So it's crazy.
To do it quickly. There were over 100 people involved in the organization to do that.
Wow.
You're also describing you're also describing a phenomenon where all of a sudden across the organization, people realized the stuff they were working on was kind of less important or not a priority in this context because all the business changed. So in a way, the whole organization knew to pause and then almost collectively came up with what's the new priority here, right? That's almost like a wartime footing. You've probably not seen that in industry before, where all of a sudden everybody wakes up and priorities are just different the next day, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. I think I would just augment what you're saying a little bit, is that we almost felt like what we were doing was almost more important than ever. And we were just doing it at a higher stakes. Like we were always trying to find people jobs and connect people in the digital economy at a massive scale. It's just now suddenly like, whether I'm really good at my job in terms of, connecting people and removing all of that friction, there were some real stakes for the hospitals that were involved. And I think it just really brought everyone together. That was pretty cool.
So tell us a little bit about the postmortem and also kind of results so far. So you mentioned, you had people requesting 30,000 doctors, 60,000 nurses, 300 volunteers a day. And you just mentioned, kind of 500,000 volunteers. Give us a sense of kind of how it's working. And is it, in some ways, is it people that are you taking advantage of the data, or are you taking advantage of how else did you help match, or what was some of the results?
Yeah, absolutely. So the top line results right now is that we have helped source over 5 million healthcare candidates and 500,000 volunteers through the program. We were very conscious as well, though, that we needed to increase the capacity for healthcare specifically, because it wasn't an effective strategy to recruit a doctor from one hospital to move it to another hospital. We actually needed to net new increase capacity here. And this is where the skills conversation that we started with at the beginning of this comes into play. So one of the things we did is we analyzed using data science, everybody who's ever applied to a healthcare job at LinkedIn. Data science modeled their skills and looked for adjacent skills and people who had non-traditional titles but would have the right background to be able to step into some of those roles, and created a cohort of 20 million individuals who we then customize their experience. So as soon as they come onto LinkedIn, they get a unique experience that you and I wouldn't have seen, that is driving them directly to apply for these frontline COVID roles. And that really worked to increase.
So your data science stuff, you came up with an algorithm or a mechanism or a set of hypotheses of what types of people that might not be frontline healthcare workers at all, but had the right kind of skills or temperament or something, analyzed those, kind of synthesized 20 million people. And then when they came in, they're like, you could be helping in healthcare.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I love this. I love the point about what they would say is doesn't mean steal from one and give to the other. That would be a zero-sum game. That's a bad thing, particularly with this situation. But this notion that, you're so close, you probably would be considered, especially during an emergency, and you'll learn on the job in some ways. And to suddenly walk onto LinkedIn that one day and suddenly see a totally different experience that's just like, we need your help. Let's go. Yeah. I mean, that must have felt amazing to the people who suddenly saw this too. What were some of the other lessons learned in doing this project in general, the sort of emergency response surge kind of thing?
Yeah, so for a few years, I've been really interested in this topic of purpose at work. I wrote a white paper a couple of years ago trying to study this on the platform. And because of my curiosity for this, I pulled a few strings internally, and I asked for us to look at the consequence, not just on the social impact, which I think I've shared a little bit about, but what was the impact of this project on employees? And throughout the process, we at LinkedIn run very frequent employee voice surveys. This is a traditional thing that a lot of organizations do wholesale once a year. At LinkedIn, we do it once a month. And so throughout this entire process, we were pulsing the employee population about their confidence in how we were handling things, how were they feeling in terms of their well-being, what was their ESAT score or their employee satisfaction of their work. And so we took this panel of people who had come together, these 100 individuals from different groups, and we looked at their experience versus the average experience and saw a really clear conclusion that purposeful projects have a positive social impact, but they also had a very high positive employee impact, with those employees having better well-being scores, better employee satisfaction scores. So that's, I think that was something really encouraging to see, and something that we want to replicate. The other thing which I haven't mentioned yet is, and this was happening, is that our talent acquisition organization, so our essentially recruiters inside of the company, of which we had hundreds, were paused. And that was happening all around the world. Recruitment was paused for a lot of organizations. And so those recruiters came together and as a community began to form something called Recruitment for Good, where they were not just, we weren't just posting jobs, but they were actively sourcing for hospitals and finding, hundreds of doctors and things like that. And we looked at that group. Again, there were 170 recruiters involved in that program internally. And we actually saw a trend of, over time, in their darkest hour where things were paused, for them, actually participating in this and being able to kind of come to work and show up and do this type of thing, actually lifted the employee satisfaction scores. So it's a reminder for us internally, and I think for everyone, that there are not always hard trade-offs between doing well and doing good. Like, we have clear social impact here, clear employee benefit here, and we just, and we've learned a lot about innovation in the process.
Yeah. Well, and I love we actually have the link we'll share with the guests, with the audience, the link for your the article you wrote with Aaron Hurst. I remember that and reading it and loving it. It was just sort of about how do we find purpose and meaning and passion in work. So we'll share that with the audience. But I think too, it's just this notion that there's almost like I've thought of this as sort of oh yeah, here's the article and we'll share the link. There's almost this general theory of relativity around purpose. Like, it's just like, I work for NASA, it turns out it's going to be an awesome place to be, or I work for LinkedIn and I'm really trying to connect people. And then there's a special theory of relativity that's sort of, what does it mean to me, and what does it mean, like, I don't work at NASA, I'm never going to work at NASA, so yeah. But how do I do it? And in some cases, what this project and the sort of for good effort did was it enabled people to grab a hold of a bigger purpose that was outside of their organization, and feel that and find where they fit. And I think there's something powerful to be said with just finding. It's not going to happen all the time, no matter what your job is. Always finding this passion and purpose, but keeping an eye out for those opportunities, like really a leadership challenge that we have to do, and something for everybody.
Absolutely.
Scott, can I
tell me? Oh, go ahead,
yeah.
Peter.
As I was doing work on economic development in cities a year ago or so, LinkedIn has interesting statistics on migration, people moving from city to city where jobs are.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you're up on that, what you're seeing, because we know that there's been a lot of migration moving around in America. And if you've got any impressions on where the workforce is going and any of the stuff you're seeing there.
I don't want to speak to it directly, but we actually have a chief economist, which is a sort of recent hire for LinkedIn, and whose responsibility is to use the economic graph, which is the way that we refer to the data on LinkedIn. Facebook has a social graph of all of our social relationships. LinkedIn is a mapping of the digital economy. So they use the economic graph to have these types of questions. I'm confident, and I can find it and send it to you so we can include it in the notes for listeners. We have been looking at that. I can say directly from a hiring perspective, we've recently added in remote work, the ability for remote work search, remote work tags and the usage of that has been very high. But specifically how people are migrating, I have seen some data on that, but I'm just not up enough to quote it.
Yep.
I think there's something interesting too. I just was trying to find the data. There was a brand new Harvard Business article that was based on a Harvard Business School study that just came out like in the last few weeks. And it was about people who are integrators versus segmenters. And when we say integrator versus segmenter, you could read that a lot of ways. What they meant by that was integrators sort of integrate their family life, their home life right into their office. They bring the pictures of the family to the office. They invite people to their homes for dinner. They have parties. They have happy hours, things like that. Segmenters sort of really get value from saying, I leave my work at work and I go and I can have my family. And it turns out that if you look at well-being stats, historically, segmenters have higher levels of well-being because they basically like can let go of work when they leave work. They are particularly suffering right now because they really can't. It's do I work at home or do I live at work or what? I don't know what it is. And this is a real challenge. And it's fascinating to see that they've started to do some studies on this. And it's really, we have to be very aware that that this is impacting people. And how do we help? I love the idea of the economic graph. I remember at a get together last year, we were able to learn a little bit more about that. And so we'll try to find a link to that and add it to the site as well. Scott, what's your background a little bit? I mean, I know you're at LinkedIn, but what's the sort of way that you feel like you really bring a superpower to projects or to the work you want? What's the thing that you're just really passionate about?
Hey, thanks.
Or there are a few. Yeah.
Thanks for asking that. I wasn't expecting that question. I appreciate that. My career started in human resources. Which is a word that I don't love. I think, Mickey, I've told you this, talked to you about this before, but, human capital or human resources and looking at individuals.
Sounds like I just put them in a bank somewhere and then I pull them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, that aside, I think just thinking about people's success and the way that people can drive the success of organizations has been a theme for me throughout my career. And, has sort of brought me to focus on what I'm focusing on today at LinkedIn. But I think, practically speaking, this project was an opportunity to bring together a number of different groups from across the organization, rally around a central purpose or cause, and achieve something together. And, that's something that I really like doing, that sort of facilitation. We've encountered each other, I think, in doing design thinking work or just taking large groups of people. I think the most interesting solutions, need to come from the intersections of very intelligent experts, of beginners' minds, of all sorts of different diversity. I really believe in that hypothesis. And, that's what we did here. We had the head of recruiting in the room with the head of product. And so, we started mashing that together in a way that is not typically, not typically done. So that was a real
Scott,
pleasure.
you and I have both been in sessions with Peter. Actually, we were in a session together where I was kind of the lead facilitator and trying to like just do this. But then you had me join one of your sessions as well. And I think what was really fascinating, was that they've shown over and over again that psychological safety leads to a greater increase in ideas generated in a group, and also more divergent ideas. Like if you feel psychologically safe. And I will say one of the things that I felt in your sessions, I probably don't create much psychological safety because I'm a little bit scattered, but one of the things that I really enjoyed was that it just felt like right before we needed to know something, we knew it. And then there was this kind of very calm sort of, you could feel the passion in the room. And I think you made that. There was an energy level kind of management going on. And I think it probably is just naturally part of you, but it was just really something that it seems like you've really honed as well, in terms of just helping people feel like it's okay to like have a little bit of crazy idea or to mash two things up. And you had an activity that I really loved, which was sort of sacrificial prototypes. You create some things that you're going to sacrifice. No, that makes sense. That's okay. Let's do that. And some other kinds of nice elements that come from the design thinking world, but you really seem to make it just work.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that COVID-19 allows for some of that experimentation, and particularly, I mentioned this idea of design loves constraints. The idea that we're launching something in 10 days, but another freedom that we had was we were experimenting with something that was all new. And for this offer, for example, we weren't saying we were going to structurally change our business model forever. We were saying, okay, for the next 6 months, like let's do whatever we can, and we can reevaluate at the end of 6 months if we can do more. But some of these changes allow for business innovation and allow for, as you say, is this sort of psychological safety to take a few more risks. And the team really did that. I mean, for example, that media solution that we found for volunteers, on day one, that was shot down in the room as being too expensive. Typically, buying media ads, not-for-profits don't have money to do that. There's an opportunity cost. There was a lot of complication, but creative solutions started to flourish, and we were able to get this down so that it was essentially like $1 a volunteer, which is kind of an unheard of cost model.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Thing. So
but it also sounds like you brought the right data thinkers into it to look at the kind of curve of where the pricing scheme was. I mean, these are things you can play with if you actually open your head and sort of do it. Do you feel like post the activity, post this project, are there things that you're just never going back to, or the companies like literally they learn something from it, and this is you're going to try to kind of do this more often, or because sometimes you pilot something and it's like, whew, emergency's over, let me go back to the way it works. And sometimes you're like, we just moved what we think we can do somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for the entire company, but I can say that we documented this process of how we did this in 10 days, how we created these, and the organization really feels like we have a responsibility to help out in this kind of social way. But the world is moving very fast, and you often don't get a lot of time to react. And specifically, I'm thinking about everything that's happened with the Black Lives Matter movement. Just weeks later, the unrest and opportunity, with that. And so we are formalizing this kind of playbook of how we can move faster so that we can create solutions more quickly for these types of things. And that team who is responsible for saying, how is LinkedIn going to drive more equity on the platform? How are we going to make sure that our products are very much a part of this change that we want to see as an organization? That team is using a lot of the patterns and things that we've learned from COVID-19 work. And hopefully, sadly, more of these types of shocks and opportunities are going to come, but I think that this can be reused in the future.
I mean, what's interesting is really describing, we know we're moving towards a world where we need resilience and where shocks to the system will come more frequently. Climate shocks, economic shocks. This is a really interesting example of learning from that and understanding that the way you do business has to adapt. And the other thing, and perhaps it's just because of the timing of COVID and then Black Lives Matter, is we've now put this whole kind of equality or justice thing on the table, and you're trying to flow that through. At least interesting to see how two big trends are flowing through. I have a related question. What are you seeing in terms of how this stuff is sticking or changing client organizations? You had an awful lot of people in healthcare who used a product of yours and now are probably looking at talent differently as well because of what you were doing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that the way healthcare organizations are thinking as well is they need to be, there's this kind of concept of a red ocean of conflict. Like there's a limited zero-sum game. It's like you taking one from the other. And there is this concept of sort of a blue ocean, or, not necessarily, but finding a third way that is potentially expansive. And from some of the conversations, that we've been having, I think healthcare companies are thinking about skill adjacencies. I think they're thinking about alternative ways to, train and maintain talent. We did see a trade-off eventually. So again, a lot of this work was done in the beginning. Elective surgeries and things began to decline, which created additional capacity. And helped balance out some of the huge surge hiring needs. We also didn't see the same kinds of spiking like we saw in New York in all kinds of areas. But I think regardless, these organizations have a much more sophisticated understanding now of the kind of surge hiring hypothesis, and also of how to use data, skill adjacencies, other markets. For example, retail, for certain healthcare roles, not doctors or, that require, but for certain healthcare roles are an excellent fit and can be recruited from and developed that way. And I don't think they were thinking about that kind of thing before. So we've been helping.
Almost opening the aperture a bit and rethinking about this. Scott, I think you're kind of perfectly setting us up to have Karan on next. So can Omid, can we bring in Karan? And so, this notion of kind of opening the aperture and seeing people for the skills, not necessarily the schools they went to, but the skills. And this notion of, wait a second, people who have to deal with being a waitress or deal with food and all this stuff, where they're keeping lots of things in their head at the same time, they're doing a lot of stuff. They're actually learning a whole bunch of skills that could be applied somewhere else. Or a social worker probably has a lot of the skills that you might need for somebody in a human resources role or in a other role. So tell us a little bit about how this idea that you co-founded something called Opportunity at Work. And can you pull us back to why did you co-found that, and how did that come about? And what are some of the outcomes you're starting to see, or some of the insights?
Yeah, thanks, Mick. And it's great to hear. There's so many threads with what you were just talking about with Scott, and maybe we can pick up on some of those later as well, because there's some really interesting things happening in healthcare from this perspective too, to tie the dots. But so the reason for Opportunity at Work is a basic premise that says, the labor market is where returns to education and where economic mobility gets realized through wages, through work, right, today. And that market, as a market, does not function. It's fundamentally broken, and it's broken for it's broken for tens of millions of people. So there are there's about 100 million people who do not have a 4-year college degree, and you'll hear me talk about stars, individuals who are skilled through alternate routes, and we've proven with data that there are about 70+ million stars who actually have skills and capabilities to be doing higher wage work, but we don't have a market that actually values, recognizes, and fundamentally develops those skills and capabilities to move from lower wage to middle and higher wage work, especially as work is changing and work is evolving.
Just for a second, I want to make sure that so these numbers are US based.
Yep.
Just so we kind of have a cartoon. But you used a lot of data to look at sort of the labor market in general, and 100 million Americans that could work don't have a college degree. Is that? I just want to make sure that we're being very clear about this.
Without a 4-year degree, we look at there's about 71 million stars who could be doing higher wage work, out of which about 30 million, we call them rising stars, could be earning more than 50% of what they're earning today if you match skills and capabilities that they're already demonstrating in work they have been doing, the work they are doing, with work that pays more. But if we took the view based on skills and capabilities, so these examples are what you were referring to, Mick, right? Like if you take a social worker, the skills and capabilities that they have, you need a lot of that in HR and labor relations. The skills and capabilities of a customer service rep or a call center rep are what you need in a lot of sales rep jobs that exist today. The skills and capabilities in somebody doing payroll and accounting are what you need in a lot of entry-level data work that's needed in terms of attention to detail, quantitative rigor, things like that. So there are these matches that can be made at a fundamental skills and capabilities level, but we don't really have a labor market where that is the currency. We have a labor market that largely values pedigree measures being, do you have a degree? Is there were you referred to this job by someone else whom I trust? But we know social networks can be privileged. I know LinkedIn is doing a lot of work on this network gap question. So there are these proxies we use that also introduce a lot of privilege and bias into the way the labor market functions. So the sort of fundamental, that's the fundamental premise of Opportunity at Work, is that this labor market is broken and it's fundamental to fixing the economic mobility issue. I think millennials will be the first generation that earns less than their parents on aggregate. Rat Chetty, others at Harvard and others have shown us the data of 90% of 30-year-olds in 1970 earn more than their parents, and that's less than 50% as it stands today. So this fundamental question of the American dream is faltering, and it's shown in the data, and a lot of it, I think, comes from what is happening in the labor market.
So before you go too much further on that, I just want to make sure that, so when you're talking about stars and rising stars, tell us what the acronym means, just as a reminder for people who've joined a little late. What's a star?
Yeah, so a STAR stands for someone who does not have a 4-year degree, but the acronym stands for Skilled Through Alternate Routes. And the reason we wanted to actually come up with the acronym is because we also are using very deficit-based language, and that is built into both mindset and narratives that we share explicitly, or a lot of times actually implicitly in the system. So we say somebody does not have a 4-year degree, they're sub-baccalaureate. We talk about what they don't have versus what they actually do have, what they bring, which are skills, capabilities, passion, motivation, curiosity, sort of this desire to progress, right? Desire to help, to be a problem solver, not be seen as a problem to be solved. These are, so even the language we use in the framing.
It's just a fundamental mindset shift in some ways. You look at somebody, you're like, oh yeah, they grew up in a single mom, drug dealing home, neighborhood. It's all negative. But I grew up in an area that had a lot of people who were new immigrants to Chicago from the world, and we had a very high ranking of gang problems and gang violence. Chicago has historically had in my neighborhood, and if you were to look at the stats and look at it deficit-wise, wow. How did anybody get out? And it turns out, if you actually look at it the other way, which is they have learned how to cope with all this crazy stuff, and they're still getting an amazing education, and they're still going out and they're playing sports, and they're still helping their community, and they're actually helping people come in and do things. And they're, in my mind, some of the most resilient people I've ever met, because they just, their reality has been a pressure cooker for things.
Yeah.
And if we see that as the opposite of a deficit, this would really open up our eyes to how valuable they are. And I think there's another component to this, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about this. How much do you really learn about the job you do when you're at university? How much? Like, it's got to be a fairly small percentage of when you actually show up at the job, you realize, oh man, those things I learned in class are not like the real world at all. So can you talk a little bit more about that and why you believe this is, a powerful reframing away from schools to sort of skills and things?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you ask, for those that are listening in, you ask yourself the question about, where did you learn certain things? What have you learned on the job versus, to your point, in more traditional college? So that's one dimension to it. The second is this lifelong dimension to this, right? So there's this notion of, okay, you go to school plus higher education for how many years if you end up going to that path or not. And then you're off into the world, and education is stopping here and work is starting here. But actually, learning is this ongoing, lifelong process. And a lot of that is developed in your life experience, in your work experience, which is the vast majority of the lifespan of most people. So we know that inherently, but we actually don't have good ways to value it and to demonstrate it and to even reflect on it. So if I had to think about what did I learn at work, I have to pause, I have to do self-reflection, I have to go through that process, I have to have some insight into that. But then when you look at resumes, typically, what are we looking for there? We're looking for proxies of number of years of experience. We're looking for that degree screen. We're looking for what major maybe that you studied, GPA, which are all proxies, but fundamentally are, there's learning that is a lot deeper than that. So this notion of skills and capabilities and learning happens all the time through life experience to work experience. How do we value that? And how do we also break the stereotype that says low wage equals low skill, because those are not equivalent to each other?
What's one of the big moves that you have tried as your organization, Opportunity at Work? And I remember you telling me a little bit about sort of getting together a bunch of tech leaders and challenging them about some of this stuff. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Like, what are some activities that Opportunity at Work is doing? What are some ways that we might be able to engage with Opportunity at Work, with the organization, and also with the data that you've collected and the kind of the idea of refactoring the labor market?
Yeah, so I'll give you three specific things to that. One is Opportunity at Work right now has been working with a number of players on what is a technology-enabled marketplace, where if you are a company, you're an employer on one side, you say, look, I'm willing to hire stars. I believe that the degree screen doesn't really tell me much. I'm looking for alternate ways to source talent. And to Scott's point earlier, a talent pool that is an additional talent pool, one that you're not poaching from each other on as companies. On that marketplace, you also have training providers who are training stars through these alternate routes, be it community colleges, be it accelerated training programs, be it on the apprenticeship-based programs. And that is designed then to solve this trust and matching problem, because employers say, okay, I can wave the screen, but how do I know then that I'm looking at a quality pool of talent? What are the alternate ways that I can assess that talent? And so there's a skills-based both matching, but then also how do you use the network and the reputation of training providers, of support systems that stars need as they build skills and capabilities to do that.
So this is this idea of this marketplace. Is one of the ideas of this that effectively, if we could just get them on the on-ramp, if we could just get them to some place where they actually are just given a chance and they've got the skills so they don't fall right away, that they could do it. So when you talk to these tech executives, are you saying like remove your bachelor degree requirement? Like what? Because there are a lot of algorithms right now in the hiring process that I've had a lot of conversation with people that were suddenly laid off because of COVID, very high level people. And they're literally like their outplacement coaches are like, no, you've got to take your resume and run it through this checker that checks what the algorithm will find. And and don't put too much experience on there because, then you'll sound like you're you should be put out to pasture or something. It's a weird thing because obviously algorithms don't have common sense, but it also is probably designed and built and fed by people that have that deficit mindset.
Yep.
Not even overtly. I mean, it's just a part of the way the culture is. So tell me a little bit more about that. Like, is that
removing the degree requirement on your job description is just the first step. Then you have to go into what are the filters and the mechanisms that you are using, and how are those built into your HRIS system, your applicant tracking system, all of those things that are being because all of this bias is actually coded in, right? So it's not actually somebody on the other side, a hiring manager saying, I want to hire X, not hire Y. You're screening out even before you come down to the pool of who's coming in for an interview or who's getting the first phone screen. And we have all these like laws on EEOC compliance around equity and, kind of being an equal opportunity employer. But all of these biases are baked in, right? So just the college degree screen, you screen out 70% of Black people, you screen out almost 80% of Latinx people by just putting that on a job description. And that is like the preferred method of recruiting today. So that's the first step. The second step is then all the things you have to do in terms of debiasing, right? That process, what I mentioned in terms of what does it mean to remove sort of those filters. But then the third step around it is also we talk about mobility in your companies, because companies will look at your workforce and you audit it. The tech companies and other executives, especially large companies, will say, look, the most diverse portion of our workforce is in frontline lower wage work. So people that are in our IT help desk, that are in our call center, that are in our retail frontline, like that's where the diversity is in our workforce. And then we look at other parts of our company and we don't see any diversity there. So what we tell them also is actually the skills and capabilities based way to think about how you do talent mobility within your company. So we're in conversations with a number of companies now in terms of how do you use this data and how do you use this understanding where you have these jobs, you break them down into skills and capabilities, and you do the mapping to say, actually, we can move people from roles, and in some cases, roles that are getting automated away, that are at risk, that are lower wage, into what growth areas look like for the company.
And isn't it the case that in your data set, you also were able to identify people who had successfully done that kind of march, but then there are things that seem like entry-level jobs that are dead ends. So there's almost this need to redesign the pathway. So maybe you could say, or Peter, you look like you have a question.
One of the things that you're describing is there are probably many intervention points here, right? One intervention point is you almost want to set aside the normal screening process and say, trust us, let's put a mechanism in because that thing's so full of biases, just try something new. Another intervention point is within the company, what are the ways that you're evaluating people? So when you engage with an organization, what's the activation level? Like how much stuff do they have to set aside to start working with you? And what does that infusion of your perspective look like?
Yeah. So on the first one where it is, okay, I just want to hire and I'm willing to source stars and hire stars, it's very little. You come to a marketplace, you get a pool of talent just like you would get it through your traditional sources. And then all you're doing is running them through the same sort of next filters that you would have as a company. Okay, here's who I'm going to do a phone screen for, and so on and so forth. So we try to make it as easy as possible to say, look, it is screening in versus screening out. So screen in to the pool that you would consider. On the second one, where it is about this internal mobility, there it is a bit more hands-on, and we're early in that work with companies because a lot of that is then doing some form of audit of where they are today, right? Like what are the kinds of roles you have today? When we look at the makeup of your talent pool today, what does that look like? Where are the surges? And how do we design with you these pathways and or like on our side as Opportunity at Work, bring in external partners, including in some cases, we're in early conversations with the technology providers. Who is your ATS system provider? Who's your HRIS system provider? Who's your LMS or your learning experience platform provider in terms of what these pathways look like? Because in some cases, Peter, you have to Mick's point, redesign in some cases the job and the work to allow for that pathway. to happen. So one of the really interesting things in looking at the data is that when you look at the last 3 jobs someone has had, and you look at transitions that they have made from one job to the other, only about 40% of transitions in the economy for stars lead to upward mobility. 60% actually are stagnant or downward, job to job, when we've looked in the last 10 years of people who've had the last 3 jobs.
60% of when you make a change is equal or down?
Yes, for stars.
And how about for like everybody?
I have to look at the data. I don't have it on my finger. And it's clear that there are certain jobs, there are about 40 to 50 jobs that are gateway jobs. They can lead, they have higher propensity to lead to upward mobility. And there's some common themes. They typically require some level of digital fluency, or they require some customer centricity, right? And or you're learning a specific workflow that you can apply in a different context. And then there are lots of dead-end jobs. I mean, you ask a lot of people, I was trying to make this the other day, what was your first job? And they say, oh, I worked at a McDonald's. Well, it turns out that if your first job today is in food service, it's likely that your third job is also in food service, paying the same or lower. It is not a gateway job anymore in the way the economy is shifting and moving. And the other thing we find is that oftentimes in the high growth roles, and I'll give you a couple of examples, there is no clear stepping stone to how you get there. So let's take data science or data as a family of roles, even the data analyst role. The vast majority of jobs today will require, I want you to have be fluent coding in either Python or R and 2 years of work experience having done that. Well, how does someone actually break into those sets of roles if that's the entry-level requirement? You see this in many different instances. You see this in the SOC analyst role in cybersecurity.
It's almost like, here's the thing that I might aspire to. There's absolutely there's like a gap.
There's no stepping stone.
And the company themselves don't know how to make it happen. And I recently was on my social media, on Twitter, and someone who wrote this major machine learning authoring system, they wrote it, like they created it, and they are known worldwide for creating it, could not get a job according to the filter that was listed because it said 7 years. He's like, I wrote it like 3 years ago. There's nobody on the planet that has 7 years of experience in this because you wrote it 3 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, it's just this little craziness. Yeah.
It's so funny. One of the most popular cybersecurity certifications, CISSP, it requires 5 years of work experience in cybersecurity for you to attain that certification. And it's sort of mind blowing, because then how do you get the job if I need 5 years of work experience to then get
catch-22 all over? Yeah. Let's bring Scott back in. We're coming up on the top of the hour. Scott, I didn't know if you had any thoughts or questions or just reactions to what Karan was saying, or just questions I want to ask as well.
Yeah, first of all, I think it's amazing work, and I'm really it's really impressive. Just we always talk about really having a sophisticated understanding of the problem that we're solving and specific solutions. Just honestly, kudos for bringing that together. I think we're thinking about a lot of similar things with LinkedIn, and we found a lot of success in training algorithms, in helping make matches based on skills as well as the sort of fundamental unit. That's I think that's a really encouraging thing for this narrative. And I can say as well that we work with tens of thousands of large companies who are running recruitment departments that represent millions of hires a year. And interestingly, they are coming to us and asking for, in my recruitment tools, how can you help me with my overall funnel this way to remove the bias that's required to help move these these groups through the funnel. And one of the common requests that we get is, what if we could just obfuscate the schools? What if we could obfuscate your picture on LinkedIn, your name, your schools? If we could take that out, that would be helpful. And so, we're really looking at different ways to make our recruiting solutions much more modular that way, so that different organizations can choose, how they, if they want to basically subscribe to these types of things, which I absolutely think they should, that we can, help them with that digitally. So it's cool.
So and I want to flag that, Karan, you and your co-founder Byron, came into our little whiteboard room over at Autodesk about a year ago, and I think by the end of like an hour or two, the wall was just covered, because you guys had both dug in so much into this information, and you were bringing an economic lens to it, but also an equity lens, and also just this, what is the real problem? Like super sort of trying to really do root cause analysis and find it. And I just was so blown away by this. Now, the person who founded LinkedIn is maybe your chairman of the board or is on your board. So
is a big anchor and backer and cares about this problem deeply.
Very much believes in it. And your co-founder, Byron, worked for the Obama administration as, deputy director for National Economic Council for Development. Yeah. So, I mean, really understands and has to, when you talk to some people who have worked in the government, not the political jobs, but the people who are just showing up every day to, make sure food is safe, to make sure the parks are still lively and everything and safe and everything. What you find is people who have to think about 300 plus million people every day. And I think that brings this lens that, these little ideas that people have that like can help 100 people it doesn't always translate. It doesn't always scale. And I really think you're trying to look at this as 70 million people, and then the subset of that, and then the subset, and how do we put them to work? Because there's plenty to do. It feels like there's lots of work to do. We can feel it every day. I want to thank you both for coming. But yeah, we'll still have time. I just want to point out it's 5:00 Pacific time, and now we're going to go into overtime. So maybe last word for anybody who's here at this moment, but then please stay because we'd like to actually just continue the conversation. Peter, is there anything you want to flag about what's coming up next in our shows in the next few weeks?
Oh yeah, we have. We're going to get back to this theme of how the art and technology world is evolving in this COVID moment. We're going to be doing a deep dive on radical simulation with the folks from Gray Area. The Gray Area Festival this year is going to be bringing together the idea of the virtual and the world and real, how we're using simulation both artistically and economically to get to places. So we're going to be talking to some of their artists. And then we're going to be doing one a little bit later on this whole issue of economic migration issues, like where is the workforce going? How there's a migration going on in our country that we're barely keeping track of because it's happening so quickly. That's why I asked you the economic graph question earlier. We're talking to some folks from Brookings about this. So we're going to try to take a look at that coming up. And that also may have electoral implications. A lot of people have moved, and so our assumptions about who's where. So those are two of the things that are coming up.
And then we do have Kay Foster and Aisha Bursell coming up at the last, I think the 25th. Kay leads a sort of portfolio life. She used to be a senior leader at Johnson & Johnson, but now she's chairman of the board at the Glide Foundation, which is a San Francisco organization that helps people have food that are homeless or that are unhoused and serves many, many thousands of people every day and every month. She'll be talking about kind of what it's like to have a third chapter in life. So she's older and she's really living this portfolio life where she's really trying to give back in new ways. And Aisha and Kay together, Aisha is an amazing Turkish industrial designer who has done just some beautiful work in the world and came up with a framework called Design the Life You Love. So the two of them are going to be talking about uncommon allies. And kind of how we can actually learn from people that are 7 years older than us, 7 years younger than us, that are coming at it from very different places. So that'll be on the 25th. So we've got a big roster coming up. We're pretty excited. Time for overtime. Karen,
I want my overtime
or
question.
Peter or anybody, yeah.
We were teeing up to this because you and Scott were talking about the fact that one thing you can do is you can obfuscate the school or the picture so that we don't show those social cues. And we're living in a moment right now where schools are charging an awful lot of money for kids being at home because you get to use the name of the school. So I just wanted to pick up this theme that I did before, which is as we are routing around and finding ways to use talent, bring people up without the cost of school, enormous crisis in higher education. So I'm just wondering, like, your thoughts on that and the degree to which traditional higher ed or American higher ed is going to be less part of the equation, or is the issue here that American higher ed better retool itself because the way it's going, it will be obsolete? How do you guys look at that?
I mean, I can share some thoughts. I'd like to just switch hats. If I can just like take off my LinkedIn, representative hat, and we do have the products that help with learning, and I do not work in that area nor speak for any of the like company's position on this. I can say a few things. So I did an MBA myself. I spoke to the dean of our school who was thinking about these types of things, and he had some interesting perspectives as well, which is the online learning courses, which are able to be deployed in a large scale, have the benefit of potentially getting the leading edge thinker in that particular area to deliver content. And the business model is very different than traditional higher ed education, where you are hiring Brene Brown to do, a leading seminar on empathy. Whereas the traditional methods are, Brene Brown needs to become a tenured professor for potentially lifetime. And the ability to, aggregate some of these like top thinkers and deliver education this way, is going to change things, and it is putting pressure and causing schools to think about how they work together. Another big implication that we're seeing in this digital is just how effective digital learning actually can be, particularly in creating a baseline of knowledge. And it's a concept that's floated around, but one that is very seldomly practiced, which is that we do this funny thing where we bring together people in classrooms and we line them up, and they just listen to an instructor in the front of the room, and then they go away and do their homework, instead of doing this completely in reverse, where they're doing the digital learning from a world leader in a very thoughtful way that opens up all sorts of new potential channels to cater to different learning styles, etc., and use the time then in the classroom, instead of to listen to a lecture or something like that, actually like collaborate and build out that material. And I hope that one of the things that we see out of this is a bit of a shift in these types of learning patterns, and how we use this time together versus how much we can successfully absorb through digital learning.
And I wonder if that changes the spec for what a higher education institution is, because on some level you're moving the expertise into the cloud or into whatever, and you're moving the high touch TA, understand that person locally, which might mean it's a less expensive proposition, or it becomes a different kind of beast.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, the core skill potentially in the classroom is very rich facilitation and creation of facilitated experiences, and not necessarily having to actually be the person who's finding the kind of cutting edge expertise.
I think also there's an opportunity maybe to bounce off of what Scott said. I think that we end up with a group of people that are well known for knowing something, or for because they sort of become almost celebrities. Think of them as the TED class, whatever. If we're going to be classist, but it's people who get up and in 17 minutes you just feel like wow, they can do anything. And some of them, of course, and many of them have incredible hard-won skills and hard-won lessons in life. But the question is sort of how many people are we completely missing because of the the biased networks of trust because of the, who people know who to even call and things like that. And so I think there's another side to this, and there is wonderful research on a great teacher by a few different dimensions can teach 100 people, 1,000 people, because they basically inspire them and get them excited and do the Socratic back and forth in a way that actually leads to identity in the student of being, mathy or being, something that they can actually find access and the sort of the different dimensions of learning. So it has nothing to do with class size. And I think that's where it's really exciting, where we see these digital tools. But I also am super excited about, if we could shift to the idea that we teach a little bit and we learn a little bit, and that everyone has something to teach and everyone has something to learn. And that the act of sort of playing these two roles over our whole lives would actually help us identify stars that are amazing at teaching people and help everybody feel a little bit more of that joy. When you have to teach something, and there's it's the mentor effect, where the mentor gets more out of it than the mentee, because they have to generalize their knowledge, and you get to see someone's eyes light up when they get something, and there's actually, it feels so good to teach somebody something where you get to see them do stuff you never thought of. So I'm hoping that this will also somehow level the field in terms of the role. I'd love to see the resume have a heck of a lot more on there about when you taught someone else something and when you mentored someone, then, I was in this Glee club, or I did this one volunteer thing. Because I actually think that's going to turn out to be more important when we stop thinking about sort of the traditional deficit approaches to these things. That's
on the higher ed question, this whole notion of, so for the most elite higher education institutions, their business model actually, or their operating model, has typically been around selectivity, around exclusion. So, which is really kind of twisted when you think about it. But the way you make it to the top of the U.S. News rankings is based on how many people do you reject from getting that education versus anything else, right? So it's this notion of exclusion versus inclusion, which is sort of what that market is built on. And then there's everything in terms of the non-selective and the community college system, where, Peter, I hear you on all the pressure that's there, and I hope that can be reformed there, because there's actually a lot of infrastructure that happens in community colleges, whether it's your career counselor, whether it's the support system, especially if that institution is designed for a working adult learner, which now is actually the demographic of who is going to college right now.
I think the community college systems are sort of unsung heroes in this, it seems like.
And what is it going to be to
restructuring
and restructure that? And some of it comes down to what is the money flow? Because how does financing happen, right? None of that system is financed based on outcomes, based on economic mobility outcomes. It's all largely financed based on butts and seats, or sort of input metrics that exist there. And so the market forces are actually not designed for mobility outcomes in the market there. And so, when employers say, look, my community college doesn't teach the skills that I need for the job I'm in, and I ask the employer, do you pay them? Because if you don't pay them, then you're like the worst customer in the world. You're expecting something from a system where there's actually no financial or incentive relationship that exists today. So this whole question of how that part of learning is financed, and then how is lifelong learning financed? If I need this notion of, it's not a vaccine, it's booster shots along the way, in this sort of lifelong, you're going to pay for that booster shot at what period of time?
I do want to, you just triggered something at the summit that Scott and Peter and I were at back in June of some year that I don't even know what year it was. We had John Irons, who was at the Ford Foundation, and he was talking about an interesting experiment where they funded this experiment with it was employers and employees that were able to put money into a 401k for learning.
Yeah,
and
like a learning.
it was portable. So it was a portable 401k for learning. And they did this study in multiple cities with multiple types of employers. And they went back and tracked it over 3 or 4 years. And they found that the employees did better economically. And the employers did better economically because they actually had employees that were paying attention and saying, I got to go learn that skill. And they were going and investing in learning a skill so they could upgrade. And this was with no tax. This was with no tax advantage that a normal 401k has. So just the pilot turned out to be a really important approach to think about lifelong learning, right? If I could have a portable 401k for learning that I could spend on learning, and
Mickey, that also supports with the
policy.
That also supports with the fact that because we are at any specific employer for fewer years, there's less incentive for an employer to fund these things. So they have to be portable, or else you don't have a well-designed system. We have a bunch of questions coming in. Charles Delicio had several, starting with the idea that have we not in America created this concept of a professional class for which a college degree is needed, which then puts a big focus on people who are educated but perhaps without experience, and do we have this goes back to the GI Bill and post World War II, where everybody's aspiring for this particular thing. Is that something that we're getting over? And I guess the related question he asks is, we haven't had real wage growth in the nation for a while, which probably is one of the reasons we're in this malaise. Any insight into how we power out of that?
Yeah, I personally think, have we created that professional class? Yeah, absolutely. And it's there in as I said, it's there in the economic data, it's there in how it's hard-coded into our systems and how the labor market works, but it's also there in terms of narrative and culture, and perceptions that we have of who is of value, who is not of value in our society. And you actually see it in our political debates too, and the polarization that's happening. There was actually a New York Times article speaking to this exact point like a couple of days ago. And so to me, this notion of how do we actually think about valuing skills and capabilities beyond that pedigree stream for the economy that we are going into, or that we are in and will be heading into, is fundamental, because actually this whole notion of the changing nature of work, if we don't get to a skills and capabilities and a lifelong learning system, we are completely screwed in that system, right? As these jobs change, as work changes around this. And I think fundamentally how we come out of that, to me, is a bit on, I'll come back to an economic system that is designed to optimize return on invested capital versus an economic system that is designed to optimize return on human capital. And a very specific example.
A lot of times this is framed in the economic arguments as shareholder value versus stakeholder value. Your stakeholders might, like, one of them might be the planet that you are taking all that resource from. It also might be the citizens in the community that your business is in. But the shareholder value has sort of won the game. And also, it's what the market will bear is the current economic theory for who's valuable. It's, those financial guys on Wall Street are paid a hell of a lot of money. They must be valuable because the economics wouldn't pay them, because it's what the market will bear. And this idea of a simplified value theory that we never had during Adam Smith's time, we had a much more nuanced debate about value theory. But today it's collapsed down into this very simple kind of value theory that ignores so much on the table. Mariana Mazzucato has probably framed this best in her book, The Value of Everything, and the work that she's doing at UCL in the UK. Before we move off that, though, you name dropped Raj Chetty, and I remember seeing him give a fascinating presentation about just taking some people early in life, like 5 years old, 8 years old, 15 years old, and moving them like 3 blocks from where they are. And it was sort of this notion that your zip code defines a lot more about what your economic return is going to be when you're 35 than your genetic code. And so tell me what you referred to him about, and some of the researchers that are doing some of this other work. What was in your mind when you said that?
Yeah, two things. One is, I mean, he's proven with data the fact that this notion of the American dream is faltering, right? And so this notion that 30 years ago, the share of 30-year-olds who were earning more than their parents was 90%. And in 2010, that number was 50%. And I'm sure if you ran the data today, it would be lower based on all the other economic indicators that exist around this. The other thing that Jesse Rothstein has also been able to show is that education, we talk about a skills gap, but there's an opportunity gap that is much bigger than the skills gap. So this notion that education, right, like what school you went to, so on and so forth, only actually factors in like 20% of, can only explain 20% of the economic mobility outcomes. The other part of it has to do with how companies hire, the social networks, your zip code, all these other things. So this notion that if you just sort of work hard and did the right thing,
buckle down, man. Go to school.
It just doesn't bear at all. And this whole question of geography, Peter, to your point, is, I mean, if you look at the 08, 09, the 08 recession, the Great Recession, while all places lost jobs, the vast majority of the jobs came back to only 25 superstar cities, like disproportionately.
They went to the superstar cities.
That's right.
And one of the big things that
never came back, right? Yeah. So we talk about, is this a V recovery? Is it a K recovery? Is it a U recovery? Is it an L recovery? It all depends on where. Like if you look at the last recession, all dependent on which zip codes. It's not a general question we can ask.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things to look at, Brookings, when they looked at all of this data before, what surprised them, especially going into like the 2016 elections and the big red-blue divide, was there's usually an economic smoothing. Generally, people move to places that are less expensive, or employers go there, and that did not happen. And that's when we got all hung up on the lack of mobility. And one of the interesting things about COVID was this a mobility shock, right? I mean, we know a lot of people have moved out of cities. Is it permanent? Is it temporary? That's one of the reasons, Scott, that I'm so interested in kind of following up with your stuff, because I think there's a lot that's going on in this moment that everybody's like either so locked down or so busy that there may be some big picture stuff we need to look at. Charlie has another question. Right. So we've got a guy asking a lot of great questions here. We talk about lifelong learning, and the other thing that we see is, once people hit 50 or 60, we start thinking less about re-educating them, or they plastically, age out. I mean, that's kind of classically, if you're a 50-year or older, a blue collar person, and your thing goes away, that's probably the most problematic thing. What are your thoughts on how that changes? Like, does retirement change? Do we change the mentality about the role of older people, or the plasticity of older people, or the re-educating of older people in all this?
I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen, but I think an interesting model was described. It was a TED Talk, and I do not know who did it, but it's stuck with me for many years, this idea, this concept of radical sabbaticals, and how interesting it is that the way we have chunked our lives into education all the way up to, for some people in society, age 25, before you're, entering the workforce, then you work nonstop until, you're able to retire. And then you have a huge amount of time in retirement. And I can speak, just from retired people that I've seen, is almost too much on the other side of, extra time. They want to be finding, these different pursuits. And instead, what if we thought about this idea of sort of radical sabbaticals, where instead of, you can enter the workforce earlier, instead of going all the way to 25, and we've already seen, I mean, we're talking about this now, this much education is not necessarily a requirement to go into the workforce and get some real learnings. And could we intersperse more deliberate patterns where you might, slow down and put some of those investment years that you would have put into education throughout your time? Personally, I've been thinking about this as well. I don't know if I want to. I don't aspire to retire at 65. I'm happy to keep working. If I could take 5 of those years though and put them in so that I could really develop myself and different ways of thinking about a career.
I love this notion of the radical sabbatical. And you reminded me that Stefan Sagmeister, who's just a stunning, wonderful and prolific graphic designer from Germany, who for a number of years had a studio in New York City. So if you ever bought like a Talking Heads album, or if you ever bought just about any other kind of album, you probably have some Stefan Sagmeister work. And he runs a studio, and years ago, I saw him speak at a talk, and he said every 7 years, he closes the studio for a year. And he tells everybody he hires, we're in year 5, there are 2 more years, we're going to close it for a year, figure it out. And he decided to do this based on what you're saying, Scott, this idea of when he looked at the calculus, did he really want to have all those years when he was 70, or did he want to have them every 7 years? Did he want to have a year? And so each year he would make sure that he told, or every 7 years, he would tell all of his clients, I'm disappearing for a year, thanks. And he would save money so that he could do it. And oftentimes a number of the studio would even decide to take it with him, but he'd like go to Indonesia for a year and not do anything having to do with design, but he can't help himself because he's kind of itchy with, wanting to make things. And so, but he would come back and he'd be just reinvented because he had that chunk of time to like reset. It's actually why I decided to do the Autodesk Fellowship, where I basically was doing okay at Maya, having a great time. And I said, everyone else is going on sabbatical. I've been doing this for 14 years. I kind of need a break. And I said, let me be an intern. And I became a exit level intern. And it was this idea of modeling that we'd pick somebody that was in their 20s that was an intern in college or school, and they would be my boss. And that's what we did. And so I had a series of bosses that owned everything about what we were doing. They just had to make sure that I just, did work because I was a slacker intern. And I actually think that that's a very valuable thing. It's a great question because I also think that the retirement idea is kind of like Hallmark came up with this holiday called Valentine's Day. It's a great way to sell cards. And I think this idea of retiring, probably we would not find this much in ancient civilizations. You were wise, you might be the shaman in the village, you might be whatever, but you were actually held on to because you probably were the only one that experienced that 100-year flood. Or you actually gave something to the community back. So I am hearing, and our September 25th episode is going to talk about this, a 1.5-year study of people who've retired and what they want in life out of products and what they want in life out of experiences. And it actually is much closer to when you go off to college. So it turns out that many of the things they want are exactly the things you want when you go off to college. You're an empty nester. You've got to meet new friends because some of them have passed away and things like that. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that then. We're coming up on 5:30. Last comments, last thoughts before we wrap, or where do we want to go?
To that, and generally, there's also this, inescapable trend on just the fishering of work, whether it's gig work, whether it's contract work, those types of things, both at the higher end and the low end, right? It's across the work spectrum. And in this question of what retirement or what happens, I actually think that can be a boon because there are many ways now to do work, not in your full-time job, or even if, your company had a quote unquote retirement age that is engaging, that is project-based, that is a learning opportunity at any age level today as that part of work and the economy shifts and has been shifting. And so might be this notion of like, what does your portfolio of gigs look like across your lifetime, and what would that look like in in your 60s or in your 70s, right, and beyond.
I think this idea of a portfolio life is interesting. How do you shift that? There's a wonderful book called Messy that I read a little while ago that actually talks about people who are high performers much later in life, and they looked at musicians, they looked at Nobel Prize winners, etc. And they actually had a fairly messy life. They had multiple projects that sort of, one would sit on the side while they worked on another, and one would be their main job, and one would be something else. And I think that's just a part of how you give yourself a chance to do some switching and jump out of something and jump into something. Omid, can you pull up the economic graph link? Because I just wanted to circle back to that. Peter had referred to it, and Scott mentioned it. And so we've got a link, and we'll also share it on with the audience. But it'd be nice to kind of pull it up. It's the economic graph challenge. We don't have to actually pull up the website, but just at least let's show it, or let people see. So this is LinkedIn's economic graph, and it gives a little bit of a sense of how things are changing and where things work. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, I mentioned the exit level intern project. I just put a link in for the exit level intern project. If you could just share that link with everybody as well. It's a HBR article that talks a little bit about, to come up with a good idea, try to come up with the worst idea possible. And that addresses this notion of how could you be an exit level intern later in life, sort of way past reverse mentoring, really trying to commit to going back and being a student. Last words, last comments. Scott, you have anything last before we wrap on this beautiful Friday evening?
I think, just as you said, there's a lot of tough stuff going on, but there's also a lot of great stuff going on. What we saw from the platform of 60% of people wanting to volunteer, just how fast that pickup happened. It exceeded all of our expectations. And it's sort of left me with, some hope in a pretty dark time. And the second, thing that I think I'm walking away from this experience with is, this concept which I've mentioned before, which is that, design loves constraint, and we can come up with some really important social answers when we get freed up to experiment, and when you have to move fast. And so I think COVID, in some ways, is closing doors, but in others is providing some opportunities as well.
Yeah, well said. Karan?
I'll just add that I think everyone can do something, and so that's sort of if you're at a company and your company is hiring someone, you can do something about it, right? Like if you're on a team, you can give exposure to someone else who might be in a different part to what you're doing, and that might spark them on a journey. In working with stars, one of the fundamental things is coaching and guidance. So even if it's not within your company or within your work, coaching and guidance is so important in everybody's life journey. If we ask every one of us here, tell me about someone who had an influence on you, it'll come back to some pivotal moment in your life and something that sparked it, and each one of us can provide that for someone else in their journey. It doesn't have to be as a teacher or as an employer or any of that. So there's just so much power even in the one act with one person.
You can actually do something. Yeah, you don't have to wait for some other system. You can do this. Yeah. And you just reminded me. I'll have my little last word, and then we'll hand it over to Peter. You just reminded me that I interviewed Alf Bingham a few months ago. So Alf created this platform called Innocentive, and it's a massive crowdsourcing platform that has about 500,000 solvers on it, and it was created when he was at Eli Lilly, early days, and it was around trying to solve some actual problems they had, and they would basically post this problem in a well-framed challenge, and then they would have bounties. And he was telling me that over 16 years, it was sort of this idea that there's always more smart people outside of the room than in the room. And he said that what they discovered is they would write a check. They became a trust platform because because it's not like a big pharmaceutical would trust a lone inventor coming up with a solution and write a $50,000 check to them. So they became this kind of thing that said, yes, we will actually get you paid. And yes, we will actually make sure that this connects. He said over 16 years of doing this, the people that consistently, 80% of the solvers that came up with the problem were people that company was never going to hire. 80%. So, because it's a global thing, and it's still around, and they just recently got acquired by Wazoku in the UK. So it's kind of mashing together both internal crowdsourcing with your own people inside of the company and external, people around the world. Thank you so much for both of you coming. I'm just happy we're able to make this happen and share some of the experiences. You're both just lights that I really appreciate and help me see in this weird time.
This like so many things, this raises questions that we have to keep getting into. It makes me curious when we come back, Scott, and talk to some of your economic graph people. As people have been physically less able to network and meet each other, are usage patterns changing on LinkedIn? Are people finding ways to use online stuff to make new connections in a way that they couldn't make connections before? There's just a lot of patterns here where COVID has been kind of a prototype for what the future looks like, and at some point we'll go back to not such an extreme future. So there's more to dig into here. Well, Mickey, this concludes our 40th show. Normally,
Congrats.
we raise a glass of wine, but not today. Today we have our 40th anniversary waffle, which we're digging into right now. Waffle.
Hey, wait a second. That's for your mom. What are you doing? Don't take that. No.
Okay.
We, Peter, and he is digging into, because the rest of us don't have that waffle.
Yeah, somebody was supposed to show up to each of our houses right now. Where's that service?
We're going to put together
and
deploy in just 10 days what would normally take 2 years to do, the ability to make
to bring up and share with your friends digitally.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Mick, Peter.
Thank you.
Great work. Love it.
Jocelyn,
Thanks, Jocelyn. Thanks, everybody who's been helping out.
It is now 5:36 Pacific Quarantine. Have a great weekend.
Let's get close, but not so close. Wartime. You can share from a distance. Wartime. Now we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.